Well, joining me this evening is also our special guest, the director of the Nehru Centre and well-known author Amish Tripathi. He's now out with his new book, The Legend of Suheldev, the king who saved India. Amish, thanks very much for joining us. Tell me, how is a story set in 11th century India about King Suheldev and the famous Battle of Baraich? What do you see as the relevance today of this book in 21st century India?
Absolute pleasure to be speaking to you as well. I felt this story is particularly important, especially in today's day, because King Suheldev's story is essentially a story of unity. Right? If there's one message that emerges from this story, is that when we Indians are united, we are undefeatable. And I'll tell you there is a true story behind it. Mine is a fictional interpretation of what are actually true events, which have been airbrushed out of history. We are told that Mahmud Ghazni came in the 1020s, attacked India 17 times. And then we are told in our history books, almost seamlessly, Muhammad Ghori came. And then the so-called Islamic rule began. I'm putting it in quotes because actually it was Turkic colonial rule, not the Islamic rule. If we don't call the British colonial rule the Christian rule, why do we call the Turkic colonial rule the Islamic rule? Indian Muslims weren't a part of the ruling elite. So in any case, Mahmud Ghazni came in the 1020s, but Muhammad Ghori came in the 1190s. That's a 160-year time difference. That's a freaking long time. Right? And this was the time. Mahmud Ghazni was a Turk, so was Muhammad Ghori, so was Alauddin Khilji, so were the Mughals, by the way. They called themselves Temuriya. We call them Mughals. They didn't call themselves Mughals. Temuriya matlab descendant of Temur. Yes. Now, these were all Turks. They were from Central Asia. Okay. And this was a time when they were actually the military superpower of the world. From the 11th to the 16th, 17th century, they'd conquered much of the world. Yes. The Arab world, India, they attacked much of China, Europe. They were the military superpower of the world. The most powerful warrior race the world has ever seen. And while this warrior race was going around massacring and destroying much of the world, they didn't come back to India for nearly 160 years. Why didn't they come back after Mahmud Ghazni all the way up to Muhammad Ghori? The answer is this man, okay, King Suheldev, right? Because he fought a battle, in 1033, 1034, the dates, depending on some accounts they vary, called the Battle of Baraich, where he defeated, and it was a devastating defeat on the Turkic army, and he killed them to the last man, right? And what makes it so inspiring is that he gathered forces of Hindus of all castes, of Buddhists, of Indian Muslims, forged an army and fought an invading army. So for me, this is a unifying story of a great Indian warrior hero who fought a foreign invasion, who forged unity and fought a foreign invading army and beat them back. History repeats itself. We are probably in the same stage right now. We need to hear that message of unity.
So history repeats itself, you're saying, Amish. When Indians unite, we are unbeatable. Are you referring to the India-China border situation as well now? Are the lessons from King Suheldev when you say we're at the same stage right now?
I don't want to speak too much on it. I'm a diplomat, but I'm just saying that, more often than not, I'm telling you, we Indians, we have lost battles not because we lacked in bravery or we lacked in resources. Our biggest problems was our own internal divisions. Right? Others didn't have to defeat us. We defeated ourselves. But when we become united, we are undefeatable. We are the only Bronze Age culture that is alive till today. Every other Bronze Age culture has been wiped out, most of them violently. Egypt, Zoroastrian Persia, Greco-Roman culture, which of them survived? They're all museum pieces. Zoroastrian Persia, one of the greatest empires of ancient India, survived for just 30 to 50 years when the Arabs attacked them. That's it, 30 to 50 years, they were all wiped out. Their only surviving remnants are in India, the Parsis. They were given refuge here. Their universities were burned down, their temples were destroyed, but we are still standing. It's because we were very brave, our resistance was fierce, we fought. Our only problem was internal divisions. And for me, King Suheldev is that is that message, which is so critical for us right now.
And I think that is an important message today as well, as you're saying. But tell me, Amish, the title of the book is also fascinating because The Warrior King Who Saved India. It almost in a way reflects what we've seen as a changing world order where strongman leaders are more popular across the world, whether you're looking perhaps at the Turkey example, whether you're looking at President Trump or even Prime Minister Modi here. So when you have the king who saved India, are you drawing any parallels here as well?
You know, I never comment on politics, especially since I'm a diplomat. I won't. But let me give an answer to this through the arc of history. Okay? You will find that in times of long peace, there is no one truth for all time. Okay, that's a fallacy. There are multiple truths, and there is truth that is relevant in a particular context. There is no one truth and one false god for all time. That's childish. Right? So it's not that any style of leadership is perfect for all time, but the kind of leadership that the common people expect in a time of peace is different from the kind of leadership that people expect in a time of change and uncertainty and insecurity. The last 70 years has been a long peace. If you read, the works of, for example, Factfulness by Hans Rosling, he uses data to show how on a per capita basis, this is the most peaceful humanity has ever been. On a per capita basis, this is the most prosperous that humanity has ever been. On a per capita basis, those who are relatively weaker, such as women or small men, as I am, right, who are relatively weaker, have never been safer on a per capita basis. A small man as I am, if I was living 200 years ago, there is no way I would have gone through my entire life without being beaten close to death at some time. I have gone through my entire life without ever having experienced this. And many people, many small men like me, can experience that. So there is a long peace, but that long peace, there is a perception that perhaps that long peace is ending. There is a time of change. So is it that people expect a different leadership? From the long arc of history, it appears obvious. In times of trouble, people expect a different kind of leadership. In times of peace, they expect a different kind of leadership. It's natural.
No, that's a fascinating view of leadership. But Amish, I'm not going to accept that you're a small man.
Physically.
No, but physically even, because your ideas are definitely big. And remember Napoleon. Right. So, Amish, leaving Napoleon and the small man analogy aside, just to ask also that what you think will be the whole new emerging world order, just if you look also at the whole pandemic and the fallout after this, what will be the new world order to emerge? Because we've seen that developed countries are actually the ones who've suffered greatly. Where do you see India's role in the new world order emerging after the corona pandemic?
Look, it's too early to say. We're in the middle of a pandemic. One can easily say that in terms of death rate, this is not the most serious pandemic that humanity has faced. We faced far worse. The Spanish flu, for example, led to approximately 50 million deaths of a much smaller population. Remember, the world's population at that time was 2.5 million. Equivalent death rate today would be 150 million deaths. We're nowhere in that range. Having said that, this is the first genuinely global pandemic because of global media and the almost instantaneous movement of information. So what is the black swan is not so much the disease. What is the black swan is a reaction to the disease. Right?
In India, we've used, of course, our parliamentary democracy based on the Westminster model, but also looking at the Indian civilizational models, which you talked about, the debate, dialogue, no one way in a sense. Do you think we are now at a unique confluence in history as well? You're, of course, a student of history. Do you think we're at a unique confluence in history where we will see Indian civilizational values perhaps emerging also in the new world, redefining, as it were, of the world order perhaps after in 2020?
I wouldn't want to compare to other civilizations, but I genuinely think that India has answers for the modern world. Let me express this from the perspective of society. We've discussed only governments and systems till now. You'll find that any massive dislocation like this, often through history, it leads to two possible reactions in society. And this, from the Justinian plague to the Spanish flu pandemic, all of them, right? You see, it's one of two reactions. One, either society rediscovers traditions and spirituality at times as well, or society doubles down on hedonism, on drugs, on why does this happen? If there's enough of a shock to the system, many people realize, like in the West, for example, there's an epidemic of loneliness. One reads news reports of so many COVID patients who've died alone at home, and people didn't even know that they have died. And this is almost impossible to think of, in India. And will there be a sense that maybe we should rediscover, a sense of community, a sense of tradition? That is one route. Or the other route could be the Roaring Twenties of the US, which was essentially a reaction to the death and destruction of the First World War and the Spanish flu pandemic, where they thought ki anyway marna hai, might as well enjoy life, right? So hedonism, drugs, free sex, everything, right? It could be one of these two routes. The problem, though, is that there is this false dichotomy presented that you either have to pick conservative traditions or you have to pick hedonism, that you can't have traditions and liberalism together. India shows a model where you can have both together. You can be deeply traditional, as I am. I am very, very traditional. I don't try to hide it. But I'm very liberal as well, because our ancient traditions are liberal. Our ancient traditions respect women's rights. They respect LGBT rights. We are not being rebellious by respecting LGBT rights. We are being truly traditional. Because that's what our ancient texts say. India can present this model. We are not being rebellious by being environmentally conscious, because we don't just respect Mother Nature, we worship Mother Nature. So being environmentally conscious is actually being traditional in the Indian way. Thinking of working for the good of the entire world, we are not being some la-di-da California liberals by following that. We are actually being genuinely traditional, because our texts say Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So I think we can offer that answer, that you can be traditional, have a strong sense of community, strong sense of roots. I am deeply patriotic. I never hide it. I'm very, very, very patriotic. But I'm also very, very deeply liberal, and there is no contradiction in that, not in the Indian way.
Absolutely. As I said, in India, there's not only one way, different ways, different routes coexist. Amish Tripathi, thanks so much for joining me live from London, and all the best with your new book. I'm looking forward to reading it.
Thank you. You take care. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.